With that as a jumping off point, Rick, you mentioned before some of the MDMA psychotherapy assisted studies, and I think one that you're involved with is now phase 3 clinical trials, and they've had remarkable success. I don't have the data at hand, but I recall that a significant fraction of patients who received this kind of treatment were radically helped by this kind of combination of talk therapy and the psychedelics. And we have this really provocative and wonderful testimonial that I'd like to play now, and just to get all your sense of response on it. So take a listen to this.
My name is Sarko Gergeryan. By day, I'm a police lieutenant with the Winthrop, Massachusetts Police Department and a psychotherapist at night. People might be shocked that a police officer is advocating for psychedelics, but I believe we're in the middle of a mental health crisis across the whole country. I want to bring psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy to the police because in policing, PTSD is a big problem. There's a lot of uncertainty with this type of work. You don't know what kind of a call is going to come in. Anytime an officer is waking up to go to work, their nervous system's activating in a really distinct kind of way. You're not going in calm. You're tensed up. You're jacked up a little bit. You have a little bit of cortisol and adrenaline going through your bloodstream. And that's a daily occurrence. Over time, over the course of an entire career, it can cause problems. We're seeing the rapid escalation of death by suicide in officers. The numbers related to depression, the numbers related to suicidality, anxiety, they're staggering. Your past and your training and experience go into the way that you act on the street. Trauma tends to narrow people's perspective. Trauma taps into fundamental fear responses. It creates an us and them perspective. We're in a point in history right now where that needs to change. It's really important for us to not have a knee on the throat of a civilian. We need to get together. We need to take walls down. And I think that medications like MDMA will be able to help with that because it'll temper down that fear response. It'll bring in new perspective or widen perspective to allow for ideas around being one group, one family. My MDMA experience was federally sanctioned, a part of a research protocol. When the medicine took effect, I had this deep, overwhelming sense of love come across me. But what happened right after that sense of love was a sense of gratitude. And it gave me the needed perspective as to how MDMA is going to help somebody that's struggling with treatment-resistant severe PTSD. Our officers will make decisions better if they are rested, if they are well, if their resiliency is at the highest capacity. I care about helping with that because I'm helping not only the officers, but that person that intersects with them in that moment where that decision might have to be made, and maybe the best possible decision will be made. We're on a precipice of a sea change in the way we help people. We need to destigmatize access. We need to speed up access. We need to get enough therapists trained because when used carefully, cautiously, with care and guidance under certain protocols, I think these medicines can be very, very effective and helpful in people dealing with their suffering.
So, I mean, that's pretty bold, right? I mean, a police officer advocating the use of what currently is a Schedule I substance. What do you guys think about what you just heard?
Well,
You're all stunned.
I think that it's tremendous. went to the International Association of Chiefs of Police conference years ago in hopes of meeting somebody like Sarko. And we did meet Sarko there. And I think this idea of the us and them, for me, it's always been that the police have been the predators and I've been the prey because of the drug war. And it's been hard for me to develop empathy for the police. But I've come to realize, the difficult job that they had, and that if we didn't have the drug war, there wouldn't be this kind of sense of separation, I'd say, between me and the police. They are really suffering. A lot of alcoholism, a lot of substance abuse, a lot of depression, a lot of suicide, as I said, in the police. What I didn't realize is that if you're a veteran and you come back to America, you have preferential hiring in the police. So we can often get people who are traumatized early in their life that may have something to do with their desire to become a veteran, to volunteer for the military. Then they get traumatized in the military. Then they come back and they work in the police, and you get further traumatized. So I think it's this willingness out of desperation from the police community, out of that sense of desperation, a willingness to look at MDMA. And I think that these are not just psychedelics for hippies in the 60s, that these are tools that should be mainstreamed, that can be mainstreamed, that can have an impact throughout many aspects, throughout the entire aspects of our culture. And I think Sarko is uniquely able, because we're so used to this idea of the police against drugs, for a police psychotherapist to talk about his own personal experience and how he sees that can help his fellow officers is just inspirational for me to see that.
Reggie, what's your take on it? I mean, do you think that there's a time in the future when whole professions, police or otherwise, may be using some of these psychedelics as a means of doing their job better?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think, personally, a lot of the issues that we have are just, it's awareness. It's always an awareness problem. It's an awareness issue. And with police, I have some friends that are police persons, and they talk about how little training they have. They receive a very short amount of training, and they're just kind of thrust out there. You're just like, trial by fire. Go for it. Good luck. That kind of a vibe, and that's a whole awareness issue. So it's not surprising to me to hear about all of the various problems that we have with police in our country specifically, but. So I think anything like more training, more psychological help, that would be great, so that people feel prepared they have a set of tools to deal with things. Also, just like on a practical level, but also on a deeper psychological level, so that there's when I was talking about extra time, that's kind of what you want in situations like that. When situations get hectic or split-second decisions need to be made that can really affect the trajectory of one to multiple people's lives, you need that sense of extra time in that you have a protocol, you've been trained, and you're making the best decision possible. So just like he said, that was my favorite thing that he said, that maybe better decisions can be made. So I think whatever helps, I think a lot of it is training, and I think part of that training should be psychological help. I think that it's very, very important for people to be trained in advance, and then also have ongoing support throughout the profession. I think we want the best people, the best trained people involved in this service. And then all the technicalities, political, always blah, 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 blah. That's always going to be a squabble. But people on the ground making decisions like that need to be better trained. So I'm all for it.
And so, Gül, do you think that's the direction that things will be going? And how does any of that relate to the work that you're doing in the laboratory?
Yeah, I mean, I think both Rick and Reggie sort of touched on this. Again, I don't think these drugs are sort of the magic bullet. I think, if you give a drug like MDMA and then you just sort of reinforce your us versus them kind of attitude, and you bond with all the other police officers, but continue to see the people that are in your community as the other, then it could be very dangerous. And so the key will be to find a way to train people to have empathy for what they previously considered the other. And the context is going to be so important for being able to sort of allow people to have that cognitive reappraisal or that transformation that I think will be necessary for these to have the desired effect. And I just, I think that this is not to plug too much for mechanism, but I do think that understanding how these drugs work will be an important part of that. Like, I don't think that it's a good idea to take a police officer who does have to sort of go out into a strange and difficult world and release them right after, a day or two after having a big MDMA experience. Because I think what our studies are telling us is that that mice and likely people also remain in that sort of sensitive, vulnerable, childlike state for weeks. And so just like you wouldn't put a child, in a rated R movie or throw them right back into, a conflict type of situation, I think, it's important to understand how these are working and how long it takes for a person to kind of be restored to that adult operational closed state of the critical period before throwing them back in the deep end. Otherwise, you'd risk re-traumatizing and actually making people worse.
Yeah, we only have a couple minutes left. I did want to ask one more question. Rick, we began early on in this conversation describing how the tide is turning, or it's turned was the language that I think you use in terms of the way the world, or at least the government agencies, are looking at psychedelics, allowing for research and possibly taking some of these psychedelics off of the Schedule I declaration. But is it also, and I think you made reference to this as well, does a kind of disaster await us if things don't unfold at the right rate and in the right order that society can absorb these changes? Could we go back to a time when all of these substances are simply outlawed?
Well, I think there's always that possibility of a backlash. And, who would have thought that democracy itself would be at stake right now? I mean, we grew up thinking that democracy was so woven into the fabric of America that had been the American Revolution, the Civil War, and that now we see democracy is fragile and it could disappear very soon, in fact, if we're not extremely careful. So I think there's always this possibility of a backlash. And I think, pacing social change according to the way that people are necessary. That's why I'm so glad for what we're doing right now, is because what's really key is public education in order to help people understand what's going on and also to shift people away from thinking that the power is in the drug. That's what's been fueling the drug war. There's good drugs, there's bad drugs. And we've lost sight of the fact that there are no such thing as good drugs or bad drugs. It's the relationship you have with it and whether that is productive or not. But I do think that there has been a lot of learning in our culture over the last 50 years since the last backlash against psychedelics. And I think the situation is more desperate now than before in terms of the amount of anxiety, depression, mental health crises, the challenges that the world is facing. So I think that there's a very good chance that we will be able to continue in this progress towards mainstreaming psychedelic psychotherapy and also then reforming drug policy and making it available for people like you and your wife to go to Amsterdam and have that all over the place. But we have to be careful, and we have to, I think the two main things that we need to do are to not oversell the benefits and not to understate the risks. And that I think those were things that happened in the 60s, that the government overstated the risks and denied that there were any benefits, and a lot of the advocates overstated the benefits and denied that there were significant risks. So I think we have to move forward with a more balanced perspective and a lot of public education. And if so, I think we'll be able to come in for a safe landing.
Yeah, that would be a great way for this to unfold. Gül, just